John Rourke climbed into the snowy Sawtooth Mountains to say goodbye, not to become a hero again. Beside him walked Max, his retired German Shepherd K9, the last living piece of the family he had lost. Then Max stopped in the blizzard, staring toward a trail no human eye could read. Buried beneath the storm was Giovanni, a disabled old man trapped in the snow with one final promise in his hands. But the mountain was not done testing them. A hungry bear circled closer, the rescue trail vanished, and John had to decide what no grieving man should face alone. If this story moves you, tell us where you're watching from, leave your thoughts, and please like and subscribe to help us reach 1,000 subscribers. John Rourke returned to the Sawtooth Range on a winter morning so clear it almost felt cruel. The sky above Idaho had been polished to a hard blue shine, and the mountains stood beneath it in their white armor, ancient and silent, like old gods who had seen every prayer and answered very few. Snow lay thick across the slopes, softening the jagged rock, covering fallen branches, hiding the scars of the land beneath a clean and merciful sheet. John knew better than to trust beautiful snow. He stood beside his dark gray truck at the trailhead, one gloved hand resting on the open tailgate, the other on the old canvas pack he had loaded before dawn. At 52, he still had the build of a man, carved by discipline rather than vanity. Broad shoulders, a compact strength through the chest and arms, the kind of body that looked less like it had been trained and more like it had endured. His face was long, slightly squared at the jaw, with a thin scar near his left brow and a faint bend in the bridge of his nose. His brown-ash hair, clipped short and practical, had gone silver at the temples. A rough two-day beard shadowed his jaw. He wore an olive-drab combat shirt beneath a charcoal winter shell. The shirt fit close to his torso, its camouflage sleeves faded from years of hard use, dark horizontal bands circling the biceps like old campaign marks no one had officially awarded. It was not a costume. It was simply one of the few things he owned that still felt honest against his skin. Beside him, Max lowered his black and gold head and sniffed the frozen air. The German Shepherd was 7 years old, large, deep-chested, and steady on his paws. His back and neck were dark as burned timber, while his chest and shoulders carried a honey-gold warmth that seemed almost defiant in the snow. A small notch marked the edge of his left ear. Silver had begun to gather around his muzzle, not enough to make him look old, only enough to make his watchfulness feel earned. Around his neck was a worn brown leather collar with a dull metal tag engraved with his name and a faded anchor. Max had once been called Military Working Dog, Asset, Partner, K9. John had never called him anything but family. The word still hurt. A year earlier, family had been a full table, 3 coffee mugs, 2 women's voices moving through the house, and Max's tail knocking against chair legs whenever Claire came home laughing too loudly. Evelyn used to complain that the dog loved their daughter more than either of them. "He has taste," Claire would say, tossing one of her wool gloves at her father. John had kept that glove. He had not meant to. After the accident, people had helped clean the house in soft voices, folding clothes, labeling boxes, trying to build order around a ruin. But the glove had stayed in the pocket of his winter jacket. Red wool, a little stretched at the fingers. Claire had been 31 when she died, old enough to have her own apartment, her own opinions, her own way of rolling her eyes when John tried to give advice. But the glove still made him think of her at 16, standing in the kitchen with snow melting in her hair, demanding pancakes at 9 at night because dinner rules were invented by cowards. Evelyn would have laughed at that. Evelyn laughed at nearly everything when she was happy. Not loudly. Her laughter rose like light under a door. John closed the tailgate a little harder than he meant to. Max looked up. "I'm fine," John said. The dog's amber eyes held him with the grave patience of a creature who had heard that lie too many times. At the ranger station, a woman in a forest green winter jacket stepped out onto the porch before John had even reached the door. Ranger Elise Hartman had the kind of face the mountains respected. Sun-browned, wind-cut, direct. Her dark blonde hair, threaded with gray, was tied low beneath a winter cap. An orange rescue rope hung at her hip, bright against the muted colors of snow and timber. "You're Rourke," she said. John paused. "That obvious?" Truck with out-of-state dents, military pack, dog who scans corners before people speak. Her eyes shifted to Max. "And you checked the weatherboard twice from the parking lot." John almost smiled. "Aw, then I'm not as reckless as I look." Reckless men check it once and decide they're smarter than weather. Elise folded her arms. Careful men check it twice and still sometimes make the same mistake. The faint smile left him. Elise softened, but only slightly. "Storm fronts moving faster than the forecast said, could stay north, could drop into the pass before evening." "I'm not going deep," John said. "One night, old family campsite. I know the route." "That's what worries me. People get hurt on routes they know. They stop seeing them." John glanced toward the mountains. He wanted to tell her that he did see them. Too well. He saw the bend in the road where the guardrail had torn. He saw broken glass glittering in snow. He saw a sheriff's deputy holding his hat in both hands because men trained to give bad news still needed somewhere to put their fingers. But those were not things a man said to a stranger before noon. So he said, "I'll turn back if it shifts." Elise studied him. Then she looked at Max, who had sat quietly at John's left side. "That dog agree with you?" John looked down. Max's ears were relaxed, but his gaze had moved past the ranger station toward the high timber. "He usually does," John said. Elise did not laugh. "Keep your radio warm. Batteries die fast and cold. Mark your trail if the snow thickens. See, and if your dog tells you something is wrong, believe him before you believe yourself." For some reason, that last sentence stayed with John long after the ranger station disappeared behind the trees. The hike began gently. Sunlight slipped through the pines in pale bands, falling across the snow like strips of old parchment. Max moved ahead, not far, always circling back when the trail narrowed or when John stopped to breathe. The dog's paws punched neat prints into the powder. John followed at a measured pace, his pack steady on his shoulders, the old wind chime wrapped carefully in wool inside it. The campsite waited near a stand of high pines overlooking a white valley. Years ago, Evelyn had named it the Balcony of the Gods, which Claire shortened to Dad's Dramatic Snow Shelf. John had pretended to be offended. Then he had spent 20 minutes arranging a camp stove behind a rock, while the two of them built a snowman, shaped somehow like a tax accountant. Now the clearing was empty. No laughter, no crooked snowman, no bright scarf tied to a branch. Only the clean hush of winter. John set up the tent with practiced efficiency. Stakes angled into hard-packed snow. Guy lines tightened, ground cloth smoothed. Inside, he laid out the sleeping bag, emergency blanket, first aid kit, flare, bear spray, food pouch, map, and radio. Order had always calmed him. It gave the mind something to do besides kneel before memory. Max watched him for a while, then wandered to the edge of the clearing. "Don't start patrolling like we're back on deployment," John said. Max looked back with an expression that clearly suggested John had never been in charge of anything important. "That's fair," John muttered. He took the wind chime from the pack last. It was small, made of dull silver metal and 5 narrow tubes, weathered enough to look like it had already survived one lifetime. Evelyn had bought it from a roadside shop years ago because, she said, it sounded like rain trying to sing. John had thought that was ridiculous. Then he had hung it above their back porch the same afternoon. After the funeral, he had taken it down. For months it had sat on his workbench beside screws, oil rags, and things he could fix. He could not fix this. That was the insult of it. A man could spend decades learning how to enter burning rooms, patch wounds, read terrain, disarm threats, survive impossible odds, and still be useless before a silent house. John tied the wind chime to a low pine branch overlooking the valley. The first note came thin and hesitant. Max came to sit beside him. For a long while, John said nothing. His breath smoked in front of him. The valley below shone white and wide, bright enough to hurt his eyes. He reached into his jacket pocket and closed his hand around Claire's glove. "I brought her up here," he finally said, voice rough. "Your mom. Claire, too." Max leaned his shoulder against John's leg. John swallowed. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do now." The wind chime answered before the mountain did. A small silver sound, fragile and stubborn. John almost broke then. Not dramatically. There was no collapse, no cry torn from the chest. His eyes simply burned, and the world blurred at the edges, and for one dangerous second he wanted to sit down in the snow and let the cold decide what he no longer could. Then Max did something strange. The dog rose, walked to the pine branch, and gently took the red wool glove from John's loose hand. He did not chew it, did not run. He carried it carefully to the base of the tree beneath the wind chime and laid it there as if placing an offering on an altar. John stared. "Max?" The dog turned back, amber eyes steady. For a moment, John was not a former SEAL, not a widower, not a father who had outlived his only child. He was only a man standing before a simple truth delivered by a dog. Grief was not something to bury and abandon. It was something to carry correctly. John stepped forward, picked up the glove, and tucked it back into his pocket. "Not yet," he whispered. "I'm not ready to leave that here." Max pressed his nose briefly against John's hand. The afternoon thinned. Clouds gathered behind the northern ridgeline without announcement, building layer upon layer until the blue sky had been swallowed by a dull iron gray. The light changed first. It flattened over the snow, stealing depth from the trees. Then came the wind. It moved through the pines with a low, ancient voice. John checked the radio. Static breathed back at him. He checked the weather band. Broken words came through, half swallowed by interference. Pressure drop, advisory, high pass, visibility. He looked toward the trail. They could pack up and descend now. Elise would probably nod in that infuriating way of hers, the way people did when they had warned you gently and you proved them right. John could live with that. But then the wind chime began to move harder. Not ring, tremble. Max stood. Every part of the dog changed. His head lifted, his ears locked forward. The soft grief companion vanished, replaced by the K9 who had once read danger in dust, breath, wire, and silence. He faced the northern slope beyond the pines, where the trees thickened and the land dipped toward a hidden ravine. John followed his gaze. Nothing moved. Only snow, only dark timber, only the coming storm. "Max," John said quietly. The dog did not look back. A gust struck the clearing, sharp enough to drive loose snow against John's boots. The wind chime snapped and flashed on its branch, ringing wild now, its small silver voice lost beneath the rising roar. Max took one step forward. "Leave it!" John ordered. Max's body quivered. He whined once, low and urgent, a sound John had heard only a handful of times. Not fear, not excitement. Alarm. John felt the old part of himself wake slowly, reluctantly, like a weapon lifted from deep water. "Max," he said again. The dog bolted. He drove into the blowing snow between the pines, black and gold body vanishing in 3 strides, his paw prints deep and fast behind him. For half a second, John did not move. Then he looked at the wind chime, thrashing on the branch as if the mountain itself were trying to shake loose the dead. He looked toward the place where Max had disappeared. He tightened the straps of his pack, grabbed the radio, checked the flare at his belt, and stepped away from the campsite. John Rourke had climbed the mountain to say goodbye to the past. But somewhere beyond the trees, in the white mouth of the storm, his dog had heard something the living could not ignore. And John followed. John followed Max into the white timber. The dog did not run wildly. That worried John more than if he had. Max moved with purpose, cutting through the pines at a low, urgent trot, his black and gold body slipping between tree trunks as the first hard grains of snow began to sweep sideways across the slope. Every few yards he stopped, lowered his muzzle to the ground, then lifted his head again, as if reading a message written in scent, pressure, and wind. John kept one hand near the radio clipped to his chest strap and the other near the flare at his belt. His boots sank deeper with every step. The soft morning snow had begun to crust on top, and beneath it the ground dropped in uneven shelves hidden by powder. The mountain was changing shape around him, hiding its own teeth. "Easy, Max," he called. Max glanced back once, not disobedient, not frightened, insistent. That look moved through John like an old command. In another life he had learned to trust small changes. The wrong silence in a village street, dust disturbed where no boot had stepped, a dog's ears turning toward a sound a man could not yet hear. But this was not a mission. There was no team at his back, no comms channel alive in his ear, no clean objective written in tactical language. There was only snow, a dog, and the hollow ache of a man who had come here to be alone. The trail vanished within 10 minutes. John marked a pine with a strip of orange tape from his pack, then another 30 yards later. Habit, not fear. Elise Hartman's warning echoed in his mind. People get hurt on routes they know. They stop seeing them. He was seeing this one now. Branches thrashed overhead, shaking loose thin veils of snow. Somewhere higher, wind pushed through rock cuts with a deep organ-like moan. The valley behind him faded until it became only a paler brightness between trunks. Max stopped at the edge of a shallow decline. John came up beside him and crouched. At first he saw only drifted snow and deadfall. Then Max nosed aside a thin layer of powder, revealing a curved groove beneath. John brushed more snow away with his glove. A narrow track emerged, too smooth for a boot, too even for a fallen branch. A wheel mark, small, deep, and wrong in this place. John's pulse changed. He followed the groove with his eyes. It wandered across the slope in a broken line, then dipped sharply toward a cluster of pines. Beside it were drag marks, staggered and erratic, as though something had been pulled, jerked, then lost control. "Who in God's name came up here on wheels?" John murmured. Max gave a low whine and moved ahead. The wheel marks ended near a fallen pine, whose trunk had split under old lightning. A shape lay half buried beneath the branches, partly hidden by a torn gray tarp. John saw the sled first, a lightweight hauling sled tipped on its side, one aluminum strut snapped and twisted outward. A pack lay open beside it, spilling a thermos, a foil emergency blanket, and a packet of crackers already dusted white. Then the shape under the tarp moved. John dropped to one knee. "Hey!" A man lay pinned against the base of the broken pine. Not dead, though the mountain had clearly started making arrangements. He was bundled in a burnt orange parka, the color dulled by snow and ice. A burgundy knit cap clung crookedly to his head. His face was narrow and deeply lined, with a high, slightly hooked nose and a short silver beard crusted with frost. One gloved hand was trapped beneath the frame of a small all-terrain wheelchair, its large wheels splayed at an ugly angle. The old man's eyes fluttered open. Dark eyes, sharp even through pain. "Well," he rasped, his accent faint but warm around the edges, "if you are St. Peter, you dress more like a depressed park ranger than I expected." John stared at him for half a beat. Then, despite the storm and the blood roaring in his ears, he nearly laughed. "Not St. Peter," John said. "Name's John," This is Max. Max had already moved in close, circling the old man's head, sniffing him carefully. The dog's posture remained guarded, but his aggression was gone. He nudged Snow away from the man's shoulder with his muzzle. The old man turned his eyes toward Max. "Ah, then I take it back. The dog is St. Peter. Much better face." "Can you tell me your name?" John asked, already unclipping his pack. "Giovanni Bellarosa." He winced as he tried to shift. "Former carpenter, current fool, occasional singer, depending on how much wine is available." "Any head injury?" "If you ask my late brother, he would say I was born with one." "Giovanni." John made his voice firmer. "Did you hit your head?" The humor faded just enough to reveal the pain beneath it. "No. Shoulder, hip, leg is numb, pride is shattered beyond repair. That one's not fatal." "Depends who sees it." John worked fast, but carefully. The wheelchair frame had trapped Giovanni's lower body against a root and a buried rock. Not crushed badly, thank God, but enough to keep him from freeing himself. The cold had done the rest. Giovanni's lips were pale, and his breathing had the shallow rhythm of a man trying not to show pain, because pain had already taken too much of his dignity. John checked for bleeding first. A shallow cut along the old man's cheek. Scraped knuckles. No major arterial wound. His right shoulder sat wrong beneath the parka, likely dislocated or badly strained. His hip had taken the impact. The greater danger was cold. "How long have you been here?" Giovanni blinked at the sky, as if the answer might be written there. "Long enough to regret several decisions. Not long enough to become wise." "Give me a number." "Maybe 40 minutes, maybe an hour. I lost my watch when the chair rolled." John braced the wheelchair frame with one boot and lifted. It resisted, frozen metal caught against root and rock. He adjusted his grip, ignored the sudden bite in his lower back, and heaved again. The frame shifted just enough. "Max," he said, "back." The dog obeyed, but only by 2 steps. John freed Giovanni's trapped hand first, then his leg. When the old man tried to move, pain flashed across his face so sharply that all his jokes vanished. John caught him under the shoulders and eased him flat onto the emergency blanket. "Stay with me," John said. "I was considering a short vacation elsewhere." "Not today." "Bossy," Giovanni whispered. "Occupational damage." John pulled a thermal blanket from his own pack, wrapped it around Giovanni, then added the old man's foil blanket over it to reflect heat. He checked Giovanni's fingers, pressed lightly at his ankle, watched for response. The circulation was poor but present, not ideal. Better than death. Max lay down against Giovanni's windward side before John told him to. The old man looked at the dog, surprised by the sudden warmth of that large body pressing against him. "He does this often?" "Only when he thinks someone belongs to him." Giovanni's eyes softened. "Fast worker." John allowed himself one breath that was almost a laugh. Then he saw the second track. Not wheel marks this time. Not human. A broad, partial impression near the sled, already half filled by blowing snow. John rose and stepped closer. The track was distorted, but the size was unmistakable. Large pad, long claw marks, heavy depth, bare, not fresh enough to panic over, fresh enough to matter. John looked at the sled. One side pouch hung open, and inside he saw food packaging, dried sausage, trail mix, maybe something sweet. Strong smells, easy to carry on wind. He shut the pouch and pulled it tight. Giovanni noticed where he was looking. "Tell me that is a very large raccoon." "No." "Unfriendly moose?" "No." "Then I withdraw the question." John checked the radio. Static. He turned his body away from the wind, raised the antenna, tried again. Ranger Station, this is John Rourke on Sawtooth North Family Trail. Do you copy? The radio hissed back with an ocean of broken ice. He tried a second channel, then the weather band. Fragments came through, warped by interference and terrain. Wind advisory, visibility, pass closure, nothing useful. His phone showed no signal. Giovanni watched him with a quiet that did not suit his face. Beneath the jokes was a man smart enough to understand bad news. "No cavalry?" he asked. "Not yet." "Ah, I was hoping for a parade." John unfolded his paper map, shielding it with his body as snow struck his shoulder. He marked their approximate location with a pencil. They were north of his camp, lower than Crest Lantern Ridge, but higher than the main trail. If he could get Giovanni stabilized and down toward the old service cut, there might be a better chance of radio line of sight. But moving him wrong could make the hip injury worse. Waiting too long could let the cold win. John hated choices that disguised themselves as math. He turned back to Giovanni. "Why were you up here alone?" Giovanni closed his eyes. For the first time he looked old in a way that had nothing to do with wrinkles. "My brother," he said. John waited. The old man lifted his left hand slightly, pointing toward the fallen sled. "Waterproof bag, inside." John found it wedged beneath a folded blanket. The bag was old but well cared for, the zipper sealed with careful hands. Inside was a small wooden box, dark walnut polished smooth by years of touch. No factory lines, no cheap carving. Whoever had made it had understood wood the way some men understood prayer. A photograph was tucked beside it. John held it just long enough to see two younger men standing on a rocky overlook, arms around each other, hair wild in the wind, laughing toward a sunrise. One looked like Giovanni before age and pain had thinned him. The other had the same nose, the same bright defiance in the eyes. "Marco," Giovanni said. The name came out warmer than the blanket around him. "My little brother," though he would fight me for calling him little. He was 71 and still cheating at cards like a criminal. John looked at the box. "Ashes?" Giovanni nodded. "We came here in 1978. 2 idiots, 1 tent, no proper boots, and a bottle of wine so bad it could remove paint. We promised we would come back when we were old." His mouth twitched. "We achieved the old part, not the timing." John slid the photograph back carefully. "You didn't tell anyone?" "If I told people, they would say no." "Maybe because this was dangerous." "Yes, and maybe because people hear old and disabled and begin speaking to you like you are a chair with opinions." Giovanni's eyes opened again, sharp as flint. "I checked the weather. Light snow, it said. I took the lower trail. I brought radio, medicine, blanket, tea. I planned badly, but I did not plan to die." John looked at him for a long moment. Anger had risen in him when he first saw the wheelchair, the sled, the broken frame. Anger was easy. It gave pain a uniform and orders. But now it lost its shape. He could not hate an old man for wanting one piece of his life to remain his own. Still, the mountain did not negotiate with motives. John packed the wooden box back into the waterproof bag and placed it against Giovanni's chest. "Your brother stays with you." Giovanni's fingers closed around the bag with surprising strength. There it was, the moment when John understood he was not rescuing a stranger from an accident. He was standing in the middle of another man's farewell. Not the same as his own, but close enough that it hurt to breathe near it. For one dangerous second, John saw the two rituals crossing like trails in snow. His wind chime waiting in the pines, Giovanni's walnut box held against a failing chest. Two men, both too stubborn to admit they had climbed a mountain because grief had asked them to. Max lifted his head. The sound had changed. John heard it only after the dog did. A crack deep among the trees, heavy enough to push through the wind. Not a branch falling from snow load, not ice breaking. Wait. Max rose slowly, his body angled toward the dark timber beyond the fallen pine. His lips pulled back, not fully, just enough to show the white edge of teeth. Giovanni saw the dog's posture and stopped joking. John moved with controlled speed. He gathered the food pouch from Giovanni's sled and sealed it inside a dry sack. Then he dragged the broken sled closer, checking whether it could be repaired enough to move the old man. The front strut was snapped, but the base might still slide if he reinforced it with rope and one of the wheelchair supports. A shadow shifted between the pines, large, low, gone. Snow swept across the space where it had been. Giovanni whispered, "John." "I saw it." "Still not a raccoon?" "No." "That is disappointing." John almost smiled, but his eyes stayed on the trees. He clipped the bear spray to the front of his jacket, where he could reach it fast. His fingers found the flare next. And the flare would burn bright and hot, useful if the bear came too close, dangerous if the wind threw sparks into dry pine needles beneath the snow crust. Every tool had a price. Every choice asked for payment. He turned to Giovanni. "Listen to me. We're going to move you lower, slowly. No sudden noise unless I tell you. Keep that blanket tight. Keep your hands inside." Giovanni swallowed. The old carpenter's face had gone pale, but he nodded. "Max," John said quietly, "guard." The German shepherd stepped between Giovanni and the tree line. The wind hit harder, erasing the wheel marks almost as quickly as John could see them. Above, the sky lowered until the mountain felt less like a place and more like a closing fist. John tightened the rope around the damaged sled, his hands moving with the old precision, the part of him that still knew how to work under threat. He had come to the Sawtooths to stand with the dead. Now the living were in front of him. And somewhere beyond the white curtain of snow, something hungry had begun to circle. The storm did not arrive like a door slamming. It came like a kingdom lowering itself over the trees. One moment, John could still see the broken sled, the fallen pine, the torn line of wheel marks fading behind them. The next, the world narrowed to a circle of white breath, dark trunks, and snow rushing sideways so hard it seemed less like weather than a living army. The mountain erased distance first, then direction, then sound. John had seen sandstorms swallow whole roads overseas. He had watched fog roll over cold water and make ships disappear like sins in prayer. But snow had its own cruelty. It did not roar all at once. It whispered. It softened the edges of danger until men walked calmly toward cliffs. Giovanni Bellarosa lay wrapped in 2 thermal layers beside the broken pine, clutching the waterproof bag against his chest. His burnt-orange parka had become a dull ember beneath the thickening frost. His face still held that stubborn, amused intelligence, but the color had drained from his lips. John crouched beside him and pressed 2 fingers lightly to the old man's neck. Fast pulse, shallow breathing, cold skin. Not good. "We need to move," Giovanni said through chattering teeth, trying to lift his head. "No," John answered. The old man blinked. "No?" "Not yet. I thought soldiers liked marching dramatically through terrible weather." "Only in bad movies." Giovanni's mouth twitched, but the effort cost him. His eyes squeezed shut as pain moved through his shoulder and hip. John looked down the slope. The trail was gone. Not hidden. Gone. The snow had filled it, shaped it, lied over it. Dragging Giovanni downhill in this visibility would risk a fall, a broken hip, or worse. They needed shelter first, heat second, communication third. All 3 had become more difficult within the last 5 minutes. Max stood near the edge of the clearing, body stiff, nose angled toward the pines. John followed the dog's stare. No movement. But there were marks. He crossed to the sled and crouched beside a patch of snow sheltered by a root mass. The track he had seen before was clearer here. Large pad, long claws, heavy weight pressing deep into the crust. The bear had circled the sled, then moved toward a tree where dark scratches climbed the bark in a rough vertical line. Not a clean hunting pattern, a hungry search pattern. John looked back at Giovanni's open pouch. Dried sausage, nuts, something sweet wrapped in wax paper. Strong smell, easy to carry on wind. Enough to pull trouble out of the timber. Max gave a low, vibrating growl. "I know," John murmured. He did not hate the bear. That mattered. Hate made men stupid. Hate gave a shape to fear and invited you to charge it. The bear was not an enemy combatant. It had no plan, no malice, no flag. It was muscle, hunger, weather, memory. Maybe it had been fed by careless campers last season. Maybe the changing freeze had drawn it out wrong. Maybe it had been driven lower by scarcity and now found itself in a storm with the scent of food, blood, and panic in the air. None of that made it safe. John moved quickly. He cut loose the torn tarp from Giovanni's sled, anchored one corner to the fallen pine, and tied the opposite ends low to two young firs. The shelter would not last all night, but it would block the worst of the wind. He packed snow along the lower edge with his boots, building a rough white wall, then snapped off dead branches to brace the tarp from beneath. Giovanni watched him with half-lidded eyes. "You build very ugly houses, John." "Ugly ones stay up. I was a carpenter. I cannot approve this. You can file a complaint when your fingers stop turning blue. I will write it on fine paper." John dragged the broken sled closer and used it as a windbreak. Then he spread his own emergency blanket beneath Giovanni's upper body, wrapped the old man tighter, and checked his shoulder again. The joint sat wrong, but not dangerously enough to fix in a storm without pain control. Stabilize first. Move later. "Can you feel your feet?" John asked. "My feet are sending formal letters of protest." Pain? Numb, tingling, embarrassed. Good enough. John pulled the radio from his chest strap and tried again. "Ranger Station, this is John Rourke, North Slope above the family trail. Injured civilian. Severe weather." Do you copy?" Static answered, thin and endless. He lifted the radio higher, turned his back to the wind, angled the antenna. Nothing. He checked it more closely. His thumb found the problem before his eyes did. The antenna had a hairline crack near the base, probably from the tumble at the fallen pine when he lifted the wheelchair frame. Not destroyed, but weakened badly enough to turn the mountain into a wall. His GPS unit still powered on, but the battery indicator had dropped faster than it should have. Cold chewed batteries like wolves. John reached for the emergency beacon clipped to the outer pocket of his pack. His hand closed on empty fabric. He went still. The small outer strap had torn. Snow was packed into the buckle. For a moment he saw it in memory. Max bolting from camp, John grabbing the pack in haste, pushing through timber, slipping once near a hidden rock. The beacon must have snapped loose somewhere behind him, maybe buried under new snow, maybe resting uselessly in a shallow drift. He had prepared. The mountain had answered each preparation with a quiet little knife. Giovanni watched him too closely. "Something missing?" "Beacon." "Important?" "Yes." "Ah." The old man drew a breath and tried to make his voice light. Then I suggest we avoid dying until you find it." John almost snapped at him, not because of the joke, because it was easier to be angry at Giovanni than at the storm, the broken antenna, the missing beacon, the old red glove in his pocket, the wind chime still swinging back at camp like a prayer he had not finished. Instead, he tightened a knot on the tarp until the cord bit into his glove. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" he asked. Giovanni's brows lifted. "We are back to scolding?" "Yes." Good. I was afraid you were getting sentimental. John turned on him. You came into winter backcountry alone, with a bad hip, limited mobility, and a storm in the forecast. A light storm. Forecast change. Yes, so do men, usually for the worse. This isn't funny? No, Giovanni said, and for the first time the humor left him completely. It is not. The storm hissed over the tarp. Max shifted at the perimeter, still watching the trees. Giovanni's fingers tightened around the waterproof bag. If I told anyone, they would have stopped me. Maybe they should have. The old man's gaze sharpened. You think because I sit in a chair sometimes, I must ask permission from everyone with stronger legs? I think you nearly died for a box of ashes. For a promise, Giovanni said. John looked away. The word struck harder than it should have. Giovanni continued, his voice thin but steady. All year, people told me what was practical. Marco is gone, Gio. You are too old, Gio. The mountain does not care, Gio. Let the past rest, Gio. He swallowed. They were not cruel people. That is the trouble. Cruelty is easy to resist. Kindness can become a locked door if everyone agrees it is for your own good. John said nothing. Marco and I made that promise before my legs betrayed me, before his lungs betrayed him, before the world began speaking to us slowly. Giovanni's breath fogged, vanished, returned. I did not come here to die. I came here because one small corner of my life still belonged to me. John stared at the snow between his boots. For a moment, the shelter, the storm, the bear tracks all receded. He heard Evelyn's wind chime from the camp in his mind, saw Claire's glove in Max's mouth, felt his own careful lie. I'm fine. Giovanni turned his head slightly, eyes resting on him with a gentleness that somehow felt more dangerous than accusation. So, the old man said, why are you here, John? John's jaw tightened. Giovanni did not blink. For the living or for the dead? The question settled between them, heavy and wet as a fallen log. John wanted to answer sharply. He wanted to say he was here because grief needed a place, because a man had the right to stand where his family once laughed, because some farewells could not be made in kitchens beside casseroles brought by neighbors who spoke too softly. But the truth was less noble. He had come to the mountain because the house had become unbearable, because Max watching him every morning felt like mercy and judgment at once, because some hidden part of him had wanted the cold to decide whether he still belonged to the world. John reached into the snow and packed another handful against the shelter wall. My reasons don't matter right now, he said. Giovanni's eyes softened. They matter, not more than survival. But they matter. Before John could respond, Max barked once, short, hard. John stood. The German shepherd had moved farther out beyond the tarp, dark body half obscured by the blowing snow. He was looking left now, not toward the first track, but toward a cluster of boulders where the timber thinned. Then Max came limping back. John saw the red before he understood it. Not much, a thin line against the snow beneath the dog's front paw. Max tried to hide the limp, because of course he did. K9 pride, John thought grimly, was just human stupidity with better ears. Come here, John said. Max resisted for half a second, eyes still on the trees. Now. The dog came. John knelt beneath the tarp and took Max's paw gently in his gloved hands. A sharp sliver of rock had cut the pad, not deep, but enough to bleed and enough to worsen if they moved far. John cleaned it with water from his canteen, while Max stood rigid and offended by the entire medical profession. You've had worse, John said softly. Max huffed. Don't argue with me. Giovanni watched, silent now. John wrapped the paw with gauze from his kit, then covered it with a strip torn from a spare cloth and secured it with tape. His movements changed as he worked. The soldier's efficiency remained, but something else entered his hands. Care without command, tenderness without performance. He checked the wrap twice, making sure it was snug but not tight, then rested his forehead briefly against Max's shoulder. The dog leaned into him. Giovanni's voice came quietly from the blanket. A man can lose a house, lose people, even lose the proper way to pray. He paused, breathing through pain. But if he can still bandage a dog's foot like that, he has not lost himself entirely. John did not look up. Snow tapped against the tarp like fingers. "Your brother say things like that, too?" John asked. "No. Marco would say the dog should charge you for nursing services." That pulled a low breath from John, almost a laugh. Max turned his head toward Giovanni, ears tilting, as if evaluating whether the old man was worth keeping. The afternoon died early. The storm thickened until the shelter became a small dim world of gray tarp, white breath, and the smell of wet wool. John knew they could not remain much longer, but moving now with Giovanni's condition and Max's cut paw would be a gamble with loaded dice. He needed to buy time. He needed to push the bear away without creating a worse problem. He gathered every scented item from Giovanni's sled and his own pack: sausage, trail mix, protein bars, a half-wrapped sandwich, even the waxed paper that held sweetness. He sealed them inside 2 bags, then wrapped those in the torn edge of the sled tarp. Giovanni watched with alarm. "That was my sandwich." "That sandwich may save your life." "It had provolone." "Then it dies honorably." John waited for the wind direction, feeling it against his cheek. Then he crawled out from under the shelter and moved 30 yards downslope, keeping low, keeping the bear spray accessible. He placed the food bundle behind a fallen log away from their shelter, far enough to draw interest, not so far that he would lose track of the bear's movement. When he returned, he took the metal cookpot from his pack and set it beside him. No sudden panic, no screaming, no wild fight. Calm made space. Fear filled it. The first shadow appeared near dusk, though dusk was mostly a guess now. A darker weight passed between 2 pines beyond the food bundle. John saw the shoulder hump, the lowered head, the slow swing of a body built for power and hunger. Giovanni whispered something in Italian that did not sound like a prayer, but probably wanted to be one. John raised a hand without looking back. Quiet. The bear stopped. It smelled the air. Snow gathered on its back. For one strange second, John felt the size of the animal not as threat, but as tragedy. It looked ancient in the storm, a wandering piece of wilderness forced too close to human fear. Then the wind shifted. John felt it change against his neck. The bear lifted its head away from the food bundle and turned toward the shelter. Max growled. "Easy," John breathed. The bear took 1 step closer. John picked up the cookpot and struck it once with the handle of his knife. The clang cracked through the trees. The bear froze. John struck again, louder. Then he raised the unlit flare in his other hand, thumb on the cap, ready, but not yet committing flame to the storm. "Go on," he said, voice low but firm. "This isn't yours." The bear huffed, a deep wet sound that carried through the snow. Max moved in front of Giovanni, placing himself between the old man and the timber. His wrapped paw pressed into the snow, but he did not shift away from pain. Giovanni's hand emerged from the blanket and rested lightly on the dog's back. "Good boy," he whispered. "Very handsome, very foolish boy." John stood between them and the bear, the flare raised now, the pot hanging from his other hand. He thought of all the ways men misunderstood courage, as noise, as attack, as refusing to tremble. But the mountain offered a harsher lesson. Sometimes courage was the discipline to remain still while every instinct begged for violence. The bear came another step. John snapped the flare cap loose. Red light waited inside his fist like a captured sunrise. He did not ignite it yet, not until he had to. The storm pressed in. The shelter creaked behind him. Max's growl deepened. Giovanni's breathing rasped under the tarp. And John Rourke held his ground, not to defeat the wild thing before him, but to keep one frightened old man and one wounded dog from becoming part of the snow. John waited until the bear withdrew into the white dark before he moved. He did not trust the retreat, not fully. Wild animals did not leave because men wished them gone. They left because the balance of risk had shifted for a moment. The flare in his hand remained unlit, the cookpot still hanging from his fingers, the bear spray clipped high on his jacket. He stood under the whispering violence of the storm and listened until the heavy breathing beyond the trees dissolved into wind. Only then did he lower his arm. Behind him, Giovanni exhaled as if he had been holding the entire mountain in his lungs. "I have decided," the old man said weakly, "that I prefer bears in paintings." John looked back. "You collect paintings?" "No, but I am willing to start." Max remained between Giovanni and the tree line, his wrapped paw pressed into the snow. The dog's ears stayed forward, but the growl had faded from his chest. John knelt beside him and checked the bandage. Damp at the edges, still holding. "You walk only if you have to," John said. Max stared at him. John sighed. "Right, that means nothing to you." The temporary shelter had done its job, barely. The tarp sagged under the weight of blown snow, the sled frame creaked against the wind, and Giovanni's shivering had worsened. Staying there would turn brave decisions into stupid ones. John's main tent was not far on a normal day. In this weather, distance had become a trickster, stretching itself between trees. But the tent had supplies. A better sleeping bag, a stove, extra layers, a chance. John surveyed the damaged sled and wheelchair frame. The front strut was broken, but the base still had enough curve to slide. He stripped a length of aluminum support from the wheelchair, lashed it across the cracked section with paracord, and reinforced it with 2 branches cut from a young fir. It was ugly work, fast work, the kind of invention that would offend any proper carpenter and maybe save his life anyway. Giovanni watched through half-closed eyes. "My professional opinion," he said, teeth clicking, "is that this sled is now illegal in 7 states. Good thing we're only in Idaho. Idaho has standards." "Not today." John eased Giovanni onto the rebuilt sled as carefully as the storm allowed. The old man swallowed a cry when his hip shifted, but he did not complain. That worried John. Giovanni's humor had become a thin candle. If it went out, the cold would have more room to enter. John wrapped him tighter, secured his torso with a rope across the blanket, and tucked the waterproof bag with Marco's ashes against his chest. "Can you hold that?" John asked. Giovanni's fingers closed around the walnut box beneath the bag. "If I drop Marco, he will complain for eternity." "Then don't." Max approached the sled and sniffed the old man's face. Giovanni lifted one trembling hand and touched the dog's neck. "You, my handsome friend," he murmured, "are promoted to supervisor." Max blinked, unimpressed by civilian authority. John looped the main rope over his own shoulder and across his chest. He did not attach it to Max. The dog's paw was already bleeding through one battle. John would not turn loyalty into labor. Max could walk beside the sled, steady it when it slipped, warn when the unseen world moved wrong. John leaned forward. The rope bit into his shoulder. The sled did not move. He reset his feet, dug his boots deeper, and pulled again. The sled lurched free with a wet scrape, sliding over the snow in a crooked line. "See?" Giovanni said faintly. "Beautiful craftsmanship." "Don't make me leave you for the bear." "The bear would appreciate my singing." "Then he'd bring you back." For the first time since the storm closed in, Giovanni laughed, a dry, broken little sound, but alive. John held on to it the way a man held on to a match in a cave. The journey back to camp became a slow argument with the mountain. Every 20 yards demanded a bargain. John gave breath, heat, strength. The mountain gave 1 yard of snow, then took half a yard back with a hidden root, a buried rock, a sudden slope. The rope carved fire across his shoulder through the winter shell. His thighs burned. His gloved hands numbed around the guideline. "Just," Max moved along the sled's left side, keeping his body close without taking the load. When the sled drifted toward a tree, Max pushed against Giovanni's blanket with his shoulder. When the terrain dipped, he barked once, sharp enough to make John stop before the sled tipped. "Good," John breathed. "Good boy." Giovanni lay staring up into the storm, his face flecked with snow, his burgundy cap nearly white now. He forced himself to talk. "I used to build cabinets," he said. "Not the cheap kind. Real joints. Dovetail, mortise, and tenon. Wood should hold because it understands itself, not because some fool drowned it in glue." John dragged the sled around a buried stump. "You always lecture during emergencies?" "I am an old man. Lecturing is one of my last legal pleasures." "Keep talking." "Ah, so now you appreciate art." "I appreciate knowing you're conscious." Giovanni's eyes closed for a moment, then opened. "Pine is misunderstood. People think it is common, soft, but if you listen while you plane it, it tells you where it wants to open. Marco never listened. He forced everything: wood, cards, women, pasta sauce." "That why he sang badly?" "Sang badly?" Giovanni turned his head as much as he could, offended on behalf of memory. "No, no. He sang with passion, terrible pitch, but passion. Once in Boise, he sang opera under a woman's window. 3 neighbors threw tomatoes. John pulled through a drift up to his knees. That sounds hostile. They threw fresh tomatoes. In winter, that is not hostility. That is investment. Even Max glanced back at that, ears tilting. John felt something loosen in his chest. Not grief. Not yet. But the knot around it shifted. Giovanni's voice, thin and stubborn, moved through the storm like an old tavern song refusing to die. At last, through the trees, John saw the dim outline of his tent. It looked smaller than he remembered. A dark wedge half buried in blowing snow, guy lines humming, the pine branch above it thrashing. The wind chime still hung there, silver tubes flashing wildly in the storm. John pulled the sled into the lee of the tent and dropped to one knee. For several seconds he could not breathe properly. His lungs worked, but the air seemed too thin to matter. Max came to his side immediately, pressing his shoulder against John's arm. "I'm good," John whispered. Max did not believe him, but allowed the lie for now. Inside the tent, John moved fast again. He got Giovanni onto the thicker sleeping bag, stripped off the wet outer blanket, replaced it with a dry one, and tucked chemical hand warmers near the old man's armpits and groin where they could help warm blood passing through the core. He checked Giovanni's fingers and feet. Cold, but not lost. Then he relit the compact stove with hands that did not shake until after the flame caught. The little blue fire rose. In the tent's dim interior, it looked almost holy. Giovanni stared at it. If that stove makes coffee, I will marry it." "It makes hot water." "A disappointing but respectable spouse." John heated water and handed him a careful sip, then cleaned the cut along Giovanni's cheek and checked the shoulder again. Not enough light, not enough room, not enough equipment, but enough to keep him alive. After that, John turned to Max. The dog had settled near the entrance, refusing the warmer center of the tent. His wrapped paw was wet now. John removed the bandage, cleaned the cut again, and wrapped it tighter with fresh gauze, then covered it with a strip of duct tape and cloth to keep snow out. Max endured the process with the solemn disgust of a king being dressed by peasants. "Stop looking at me like that," John said. "You'd be worse at this." Max's tail thumped once. Giovanni watched them from the sleeping bag. His face had regained the faintest trace of color. "He trusts you with pain," the old man said. John tied off the bandage. "He trusts me with everything. That is heavier." John did not answer. The wind slammed against the tent, flattening one wall inward before the guy lines snapped it back. For a moment, Evelyn's wind chime rang outside, high and frantic. Giovanni's eyes moved toward the sound. "What is that?" John finished securing Max's paw. "Wind chime." "Odd thing to bring into a storm." "My wife's." The tent became quiet except for the stove and the weather. John did not know why he said more. Perhaps exhaustion had thinned him. Perhaps Giovanni's nearness to death made small evasions feel childish. "Evelyn bought it years ago," he said. "Said it sounded like rain trying to sing." Giovanni smiled faintly. "Good woman." "She was." "And the red glove I saw in your pocket?" John's hand went still. Max lowered his head onto his paws. "My daughter's," John said after a long pause. "Claire. She was grown, still left things everywhere like she was 17. That is a daughter's sacred duty." John looked at the stove flame rather than at the old man. "They died last winter." Giovanni's expression changed, but not into pity. Pity would have made John close like a door. What came into the old carpenter's face was recognition, the grave nod of one ruined country seeing another across a river. "I am sorry," Giovanni said. John nodded once. "I came up here to leave something behind," he admitted. "I thought, if I could hang the chime here, maybe—" He stopped. The rest of the sentence had no shape. "Maybe the mountain would take what the house could not hold," Giovanni said. John looked at him then. The old man did not rush to fill the silence. He simply lay there, breathing carefully, one hand over the walnut box that held Marco. Outside, snow scratched at the tent like 1,000 small ghosts, asking to be let in. "The dead do not need us to die with them," Giovanni said at last. "They need us to live kindly with what they left in us." John's throat tightened. It was not a grand sentence. It did not fix anything. It did not unlock the room inside him where Evelyn still laughed and Claire still demanded pancakes at impossible hours. But it did what true words sometimes do. It found a crack and placed a small lamp there. Max lifted his head. At first John thought the dog was reacting to him. Then he heard it. A sound outside the tent. Not wind. A slow drag in the snow. A huff. Weight circling. John killed the stove flame. Darkness dropped. Giovanni did not speak. Max rose silently, though pain flashed through his injured paw. John caught his collar before he could push through the tent flap. "Stay," John breathed. The bear came close enough that John could hear its breath. The scent of it entered the tent. Wet fur, earth, hunger. It nosed near the sled outside, snuffling, pushing through scraps of snow where blood and food scent still clung despite John's efforts. The tent wall trembled as something brushed against it. Max's growl began low in his chest. John clamped one hand gently over the dog's muzzle, the other reaching for the flare. "Easy, not yet." The bear pressed closer. One of the front guy lines snapped. The tent lurched. Giovanni gasped as the wall collapsed inward, showering them with frost. Max twisted free before John could hold him, not attacking, but lunging toward the entrance to place himself between the bear and the old man. "No," John hissed. He grabbed Max's harness and hauled him back just as the bear struck the outside of the tent with one heavy paw. The blow bent a support pole. The stove tipped, scattering ash and knocking the radio from its pocket near the entrance. The radio slid through the loosened flap and vanished into the snow outside. The second pole cracked. John seized the cookpot and struck it hard against the bent frame. The sound exploded inside the tent. The bear recoiled with a grunt. John struck again, then cracked the flare just enough to spill a harsh red glow through the fabric without throwing open the flap. Light pulsed against the tent wall like fire caught in a lung. The bear backed away. A moment later, its heavy shape moved past the entrance, blurred by snow and red light, then faded into the storm. John held still until his arms ached. Only when the silence returned did he let the flare die down and lower the pot. The tent was half collapsed. The stove was out. One pole had splintered. Snow poured steadily through a torn seam. The radio was gone outside, buried somewhere in the dark. Max stood shaking, not from fear, but from the strain of not charging. Giovanni's shivering had worsened again. John breathed once, twice. Then he reached past the sagging tent wall and unhooked Evelyn's wind chime from the branch outside. The snow stung his face as he brought it in. The silver tubes were cold enough to burn his fingers through the glove. He wrapped it carefully and tied it to the outside of his pack. Giovanni watched him in the dim red afterglow. "You are taking it back?" John looked at the broken tent, the wounded dog, the old man fighting to stay warm. "Yes." "Good. I'm not ready to leave it here." Giovanni's voice was barely above the storm. "Then do not." John pulled his pack straps tight and began sorting what they could carry. He did not yet know the safest route. He did not know if the bear would return. He did not know how far Giovanni could last or how much pain Max would hide before the paw failed him. But he knew this. Waiting for clear weather had become another way to surrender. John looked at the two lives in the ruined tent and felt something inside him turn, not healed, not whole, but facing forward. "We move when the wind drops, Edith," he said. "No more waiting." Outside, the storm raged against the mountain. Inside, 3 hearts kept burning. Morning came without sunrise. It seeped into the ruined tent as a thin gray pressure, turning the snow outside from black to ash. The storm had not stopped. It had only grown tired enough to breathe more slowly. Wind still moved over the ridge in long, bitter pulls, but the violent hammering had eased. For the first time in hours, John could hear individual sounds again, the tick of ice against fabric, Giovanni's shallow breathing, Max shifting his weight from one paw to the other. John had not slept. He had spent the night repairing what could be repaired and admitting, one item at a time, what could not. The stove worked, but only if kept shielded from the torn side of the tent. The radio was gone, under fresh snow outside, and not worth searching for in the dark. One tent pole had split beyond use. The sled could still slide, though it now looked like something built by a desperate man and judged harshly by every carpenter in Idaho. Giovanni opened his eyes as John checked his pulse. "Am I alive?" the old man asked. "Mostly." "Then your medical technique is either excellent or very lucky." "Let's not insult luck." John pressed the back of his fingers against Giovanni's cheek, then checked the skin at his neck. Still cold. Too cold. His pulse was weaker than John wanted, but the old man's eyes were clear enough to worry him. Men near collapse sometimes found strange clarity, as if the body, knowing it might soon leave the world, handed the mind one last clean window. "How bad?" Giovanni asked. "Bad enough that we move now." "Ah, the honest kind of bad." John gave him water in small sips. Then he checked Max's paw. The bandage was stiff with frozen edges, but had kept the wound covered. When John pressed gently near the pad, Max did not pull away, but his ears tilted back. Pain, controlled and hidden. The dog's old pride was still intact, which was inconvenient and deeply familiar. "You can walk," John said softly. "But you don't pull." Max looked offended. "Don't start. I already have one stubborn old man on a sled." From the sleeping bag, Giovanni raised a weak finger. "I heard that." "You were meant to." The plan was simple in the way survival plans were simple. Leave nearly everything, take only what kept them alive, and move before the next system buried the root completely. John packed the first aid kit, bear spray, remaining flare, water, 2 thermal blankets, a knife, the map, Giovanni's medication, and the wind chime. The rest he left. Dry socks, extra food, a small repair kit, things that would have mattered yesterday. Today, weight had become an enemy, wearing a useful mask. He secured Giovanni onto the sled with rope across the chest and hips, padded wherever the bindings might bite, and placed the walnut box inside the old man's parka, close to the heart. He gave Giovanni a strip of aluminum from the broken chair frame. "Every few minutes," John said, "tap it against the sled rail. 3 beats, slow. If searchers are close, sound travels oddly in snow." Giovanni looked at the strip. "You are giving the old man a percussion instrument." "I'm giving the old man a job." "Dangerous? I may form a band." "Survive first, rehearse later." John looped the main rope over his shoulder and around his chest. Max took position on the right side of the sled, close enough to steady it if it drifted, but not bearing the weight. The dog glanced once at the ruined tent, then at John. John understood the look. Max did not like leaving shelter, even broken shelter. Neither did he. But the tent had become a coffin with fabric walls. They moved. The first 100 yards took nearly 20 minutes. Snow had erased the world overnight. The path John had marked with strips of orange tape still existed in pieces, bright flashes on pine bark appearing and vanishing through blown powder. He followed them when he could, his mind stitching direction from memory, slope, wind, tree spacing, and instinct. Each step dragged the rope deeper into his shoulder. The sled scraped, stuck, lurched, then slid forward. Behind him, Giovanni tapped 3 slow beats against the rail. Clink, clink, clink. A small, stubborn sound. Max walked beside the sled with his head low, sometimes nudging the edge when it veered, sometimes stopping to taste the air. His limp was slight but undeniable now. Each time John noticed it, a thought rose like a dark bird. If Max stayed behind, the sled would move faster. He hated himself for thinking it, but survival did not care what thoughts shamed a man. It put every option on the table, even the ones that cut. They reached a narrow stand of firs where the wind softened. John stopped to catch his breath and check Giovanni's color. The old man's lips had paled again, but his eyes were open. Too open. "You are doing mathematics," Giovanni said. John frowned. "What?" "Men get a certain look when they are deciding which piece of their heart can be cut away to save the rest." John said nothing. Giovanni's gaze shifted to Max, who stood a few feet away with his injured paw lifted slightly from the snow. "Do not leave the dog." John's jaw tightened. "I didn't say that." "You did not have to." The wind moved between the trees, carrying a veil of loose snow. Giovanni's face, half buried in blankets, looked carved from old ivory and stubborn fire. "Listen to me," he said. "A man may leave a pack, a tent, food, pride, if he is lucky enough to misplace it, but not the creature who still believes he belongs to the world." John looked at Max. The dog looked back, amber eyes steady, as if waiting for the verdict and already forgiving the judge. Giovanni's voice grew quieter. "An old man like me may be spared by the mountain, or not. That is between me and whatever committee handles foolish carpenters in heaven. But if you leave that dog behind, John, you will reach the bottom and discover you are still up here." The words struck differently than his question the day before. Not sharper, deeper. John had thought of Max as his last responsibility, the living being that forced him into mornings, meals, movement. But watching the dog stand there, Hurting and unwilling to abandon his post, John understood the truth had been kinder and more terrible. Max had not kept him alive because duty required it. Max had kept him alive because love did not know how to resign. John crouched in front of the dog and tightened the cloth around the injured paw. "We go together," he said. Max touched his nose to John's chin once, brief as a blessing. Giovanni closed his eyes. "Good. Now pull, Navy. I am freezing artistically." John almost laughed. Then he leaned into the rope again. By mid-morning they reached a shallow saddle between two ridges. The storm clouds broke just enough to show the shape of the Sawtooths ahead, white peaks rising from the world like the bones of sleeping giants. Downhill, somewhere beyond a blur of timber and wind-scoured rock, lay the route toward Sawtooth Pass Rescue Shelter. John unfolded the map beneath his arm, shielding it from snow. The safest direction was down and west. Slow, difficult, but direct. Giovanni was looking north, not at the safest route, at a lower spur of rock extending from the ridge, half hidden behind wind-bent pines. It was not Crest Lantern Ridge. The real overlook stood higher, farther, impossible now. Just, but from that smaller spur, a man might still see the eastern line of peaks where sunrise on kinder days lifted gold over the snow. John saw the old man's face and understood before Giovanni spoke. "No?" Giovanni whispered. John waited. "Forget it," Giovanni said. "We go down. Marco will forgive me." His hand pressed against the walnut box beneath his coat. The lie sat between them, frail and obvious. John looked west again, then north. He measured the slope, the wind, the distance. The spur was not far, maybe 200 yards off the safer line. The approach was gradual, not steep. No cornice visible. Trees on one side to break the wind. The delay would cost them time and strength, but not enough to kill them if he managed it right. Maybe? He hated maybe. Giovanni opened his eyes again. "Do not even think it." "I'm not thinking." "That is rarely good news." John folded the map. "There's a lower outcrop. We don't go to Crest Lantern. We don't climb higher than the saddle. We take 5 minutes." Giovanni stared at him. "That is foolish." "Yes." "Dangerous." "Less than staying where we are." "Sentimental." John looked at him. "Probably." The old man's mouth trembled. He turned his face away, but the tears froze before they could travel far. "I told him we would stand there together," Giovanni said. "I told him when we were young enough to believe promises were stronger than bodies." John adjusted the rope. Bodies lose. Promises adapt. For a moment, Giovanni could not speak. Then he tapped the aluminum strip once against the sled rail. Not a signal. An agreement. John pulled them toward the lower spur. The detour was harder than it had looked. Wind swept across the open stretch, trying to shove the sled sideways. Max moved close on the downhill side, bracing with his body whenever the sled began to slide. John kept the pace slow, painfully slow, letting the rope cut into him rather than risk a sudden jerk. At the outcrop, the world opened. The storm thinned for a brief, impossible interval. Clouds tore apart in the east, and a pale winter sun pushed through. Not bright, not warm, but present. Its light touched the peaks in thin silver bands. Snow lifted in the air like ash from a sacred fire. John braced the sled against a flat rock and helped Giovanni sit higher. The old man's hand shook as he pulled the walnut box from his coat. For the first time, John saw the carving on the lid clearly. 2 pine trees, a ridge line, and beneath it, in small, careful letters, M.B. Giovanni ran his thumb over the initials. "My brother cheated at cards," he said. "Borrowed tools and returned them dull. Sang Puccini as if Puccini had personally wronged him." His voice broke. And when my legs got bad, he built ramps at my house before I asked. Bad ramps. Ugly ramps. But strong. John stood beside him, one hand resting lightly on Max's back. Giovanni opened the box. He did not scatter all the ashes, only a small portion, taken carefully, reverently, between fingers that had once shaped wood into cabinets meant to outlive their makers. The wind came gently then. It lifted the gray dust from Giovanni's hand and carried it outward over the white slope. For a second, the ashes did not vanish. They shimmered in the morning light, suspended between earth and sky, between arrival and farewell. Giovanni spoke in a voice so soft that John almost did not hear. We came back, Marco. Not the right place, maybe, but close enough that God should not be petty. John let out a sound that was half laugh, half grief. Max sat down beside the sled, ears up, chest lifted, despite the pain in his paw. He looked less like a dog at that moment than a guardian carved from shadow and honey-colored flame, keeping watch over a ceremony no church would record. John thought of Evelyn's wind chime inside his pack. He thought of Claire's red glove. He did not take them out. Not yet. But for the first time he imagined a day when doing so would not feel like betrayal. Giovanni closed the box and pressed it to his chest. His breathing was weak, but his face had changed. Not healed, not safe, but no longer unfinished. "Thank you," he said. John shook his head. "We're not done." "No," Giovanni said, but I think he heard. The clouds began closing again. John turned back toward the descent. Then Max stood so fast his injured paw slipped. His ears locked toward the lower timber. John followed his gaze and felt the small space of peace collapse. A sound rolled up from the trees, deep, heavy. Not close enough to strike, but close enough to claim the root. The bear emerged below them, partially hidden by blowing snow, its dark mass moving between two pines near the line John had planned to take. It lifted its head. The wind shifted across the ridge, carrying their scent down toward it. Behind them, the second wall of storm advanced over the peaks, darker, thicker, closing the morning like a gate of ice. Giovanni whispered, "That is not ideal." John unclipped the bear spray and looked at the slope, the sled, Max's injured paw, the old man's exhausted face, and the bear standing between them and the way down. "No," he said quietly. "It isn't." He tightened the rope across his chest. The promise had been given breath. Now they had to get the living off the mountain. The bear stood between them and the way down. It was not close enough for John to smell its breath, but close enough for the old animal weight of it to change the air. Snow moved around its dark shoulders, its head lifted and lowered, testing the wind. Behind it, the timber fell away toward the route John had chosen. Behind John, the second storm pressed over the ridge, sealing the morning in layers of iron cloud. There was no clean path. There was never a clean path when life decided to count what a man loved. John lowered himself beside Giovanni's sled. "We're moving to that structure." Giovanni followed his gaze. A little downslope, half buried behind a shoulder of rock, stood the remains of an old rescue shelter. It was not much more than a wooden frame with one wall leaning inward and a roof of corrugated metal bowed under ice. But it had 3 sides. 3 sides were better than the open throat of the mountain. "That," Giovanni breathed, "is a shed that lost an argument. It only has to win 5 minutes." "I admire your optimism." John tightened the rope across his chest. "Max, close." The German shepherd moved beside the sled, body low, injured paw stiff but still working. John pulled. The sled slid forward reluctantly, scraping over crusted snow. He did not run. Running would panic the bear. Running would tip Giovanni. Running would invite every bad ending at once. So John walked, slow, controlled, every step an act of defiance disguised as patience. The bear watched them. It huffed once, a deep sound that rolled through the snow. Max growled, but John snapped his fingers low at his side. "Leave it." Max obeyed, though the effort shook through his body. They reached the shelter with the storm clawing at their backs. John dragged Giovanni inside first, propping the sled against the remaining interior wall. The shelter smelled of old wood, frozen dirt, and rust. A faded warning sign hung crookedly near the entrance, its letters half scratched away by years of weather. Giovanni looked around. "I have rented worse apartments." "Good, you'll feel at home." John set him behind the thickest beam, then placed the thermal blanket over his chest. He shoved snow against gaps in the lower wall with one boot, making a crude windbreak. Max stood in the open doorway. The dog's fur had lifted along his spine. His ears were forward. His eyes were locked on the bear, which had begun moving again, not charging, not yet, but coming with the slow certainty of hunger and confusion. John did not imagine himself stronger than the animal. That was how men died in stories told by rangers with tired eyes. He could not beat a bear. He could only change the problem long enough for them to survive it. He emptied what he had left onto the floor, the last flare, bear spray, the dented cookpot, his knife, a strip of rope, and his charcoal winter shell. From a pouch he pulled the last food items, wrapped tight and crushed from the journey. Protein bar, sugared nuts, the remains of Giovanni's heroic provolone sandwich. Giovanni's eyes narrowed. "If that sandwich saves us twice, I want it mentioned at my funeral." "No funerals today." John wrapped the food inside his jacket, tied the bundle tight, and looked toward the slope to the left of the shelter. A shallow depression led away between two boulders. If he could draw the bear's attention there, even briefly, he might get the group moving down the opposite side. The trick was not to challenge the bear. The trick was to convince the mountain's hungry monarch that something easier waited elsewhere. John stepped outside with the bundle in one hand and the cookpot in the other. Max tried to follow. "Stay." The dog ignored him. John turned sharply. "Max, stay with Giovanni." That landed. Not because Max wanted to obey, but because the command gave him a job. The dog backed into the doorway, planting himself between Giovanni and the open snow. John moved 10 yards out, then 15. The bear stopped. Its head swung toward him. John could feel the size of it in his ribs, as if the animal carried its own weather. He threw the jacket bundle hard toward the depression. It hit snow near the boulders and rolled. The food scent broke open. The bear turned. John struck the cookpot with the handle of his knife. Clang! The sound rang bright and ugly across the slope. He struck again. Clang! Clang! The bear shifted toward the food bundle. For 3 breaths, the plan worked. John backed toward the shelter. "Giovanni, when I say, we move." The old man lifted the aluminum strip in his shaking hand. "I am ready to perform my solo." "Not yet." The bear reached the bundle and nosed it. It pawed once, tearing cloth. John kept backing up, slowly, never turning his back fully. Max stood rigid in the doorway, trembling with the effort to remain. Then the wind changed. It came down from the ridge in a cold, sudden sweep, cutting across the shelter, across Giovanni's blood-stained blanket, across Max's wet fur, across John's sweat and fear. The bear lifted its head. The food bundle was forgotten. Its attention came back to them. "John," Giovanni said quietly. "I know." The bear moved faster, not a full charge, a committed approach. The difference mattered in theory. In practice, the earth still seemed to shake beneath its paws. Max broke from the doorway. "No!" The dog hurled himself into the snow between the bear and the shelter, teeth bared, chest forward, injured paw hitting the ground with a stumble he refused to acknowledge. He did not attack. He made himself a wall. Giovanni began striking the aluminum strip against the shelter frame. Clang, clang, clang. Weak sounds, but steady. Human, defiant. "Not today," the old man rasped. "You hear me, beast? Not today." John grabbed the flare. The cap snapped free. Red fire exploded in his hand. The world turned crimson. Snow became sparks. The shelter became a black skeleton. John's face and hands glowed as if forged in some ancient furnace under the mountain. He lowered the flare toward the ground, angling it away from the bear, but bright enough to fill the space between them. The bear stopped. It reared partly, then dropped, roaring into the red light. The sound struck John in the chest. Giovanni's tapping faltered. Max did not move. John advanced one step, not toward the bear, but toward Max. "Back!" he ordered. "Max, back!" The dog would not. The bear swiped at the snow in front of it, sending a spray of white into the air. Its paw did not strike John directly, but the motion threw snow and ice hard enough to make him flinch. He stepped on buried rock, lost balance, and went down sideways. His shoulder hit stone beneath the powder, and pain flashed white through him. The flare fell from his hand, still burning. Max turned instantly. He seized the strap of John's pack in his teeth and pulled. John could barely breathe. The impact had knocked the air out of him, and for a moment the world narrowed to Max's amber eyes and the harsh sound of Giovanni's aluminum strip beating against wood. Clang, clang, clang. Not a rescue signal now. A heartbeat. John rolled onto one knee. The bear had advanced again, confused by the flare, drawn by movement, trapped by hunger between fear and opportunity. John reached for the bear spray. His fingers found the canister. Before he could aim, the mountain answered with a sound that did not belong to wind. A whistle. Thin at first, then louder. A human whistle. Then a voice, amplified and sharp, through a storm speaker. "Stand clear of the animal. Do not run." John turned his head. Figures appeared through the snow below the slope, 4 of them, moving in a staggered line. Bright orange rope flashed against forest green jackets. Headlamps cut through the white. At the front was Ranger Elise Hartman, her face half covered by a frost-lined neck gaiter, one hand raised, the other gripping a launcher designed for wildlife deterrent rounds. She had not arrived like a miracle. She had arrived like a woman who had spent hours reading small signs left by desperate people. Later, John would learn the chain of it. Giovanni's vehicle at the trailhead, parked too long. John's truck beside it. Elise's memory of a grieving man with a K9 and too much silence in his eyes. Orange tape on pines, a broken track in snow, the strange 3-beat ringing of aluminum against sled and wood traveling through the storm in uneven fragments. But in that moment, all John knew was that the mountain had finally produced another human voice. Elise fired the first deterrent round, high and wide. A bright crack split the air above the bear, followed by a flash that lit the snow beyond it. Another ranger struck a metal clapper and shouted. A third raised an air horn. Noise came from multiple directions, not closing in, but pushing, creating pressure, giving the bear an exit. The animal swung its head, overwhelmed. Elise shouted again, "Give it the tree line! Let it move!" John understood and grabbed Max by the harness, pulling him back with the last of his strength. Max resisted for one terrifying second, then yielded, limping backward until John could shield him with his body. The bear huffed, turned toward the open gap between the boulders, and lumbered away through the snow. It did not flee like a villain defeated. It withdrew like a hungry creature choosing life over conflict. No one fired a bullet. When the dark shape vanished into the timber, John's body gave up the authority his mind had been borrowing. He sank to one knee, then both. Max pressed against him, panting, shivering, still trying to stand guard. Elise reached him first. Up close, she looked older than she had at the ranger station, not in years, but in weather. Ice clung to her lashes. Her jaw was set with controlled fury, not at him alone, but at storms, maps, stubborn men, and every mountain that demanded payment before releasing the living. "You picked a hell of a morning walk, Rourke," she said. John tried to answer. Nothing useful came out. Her eyes flicked to Max, then to Giovanni in the shelter. "Medical team, now." The rescue crew moved with practiced calm. One ranger knelt by Giovanni, checking pulse and responsiveness. Another unfolded a compact rescue litter. A third approached Max carefully, not making the mistake of assuming a wounded K9 would welcome strange hands. Giovanni, pale as old candle wax, lifted one finger toward Max. "That dog," he whispered. "Get steak. Not kibble. Steak. Put it in your official report." Elise looked at him. "Sir, I'll be sure to notify the governor." "And soup for John," Giovanni added. "Hot, with a doctor who scolds." John managed a faint breath that might have been a laugh. Then the strength left his arms. He fell sideways into the snow, but his hand closed around Max's collar before he hit the ground. Not a command, not a restraint, an anchor. Max immediately lowered himself beside John, pressing his muzzle against John's chest. The dog listened. One breath, then another. Elise crouched, her voice lower now. "John, stay with me." He opened his eyes enough to see the white sky above her shoulder. "I've got him," she said, and he knew she meant Giovanni. "Max, all of it. Nobody's being left up here." The words moved through him slowly. Nobody. The rescuers slid Giovanni onto the litter. He complained about the angle, the cold, the disrespect shown to elderly musicians who had not yet formed their band. His voice was weak, but it remained in the world. Another ranger checked Max's paw, wrapping an additional protective layer over John's bandage. Max tolerated it only because John's hand stayed on his collar. Then they loaded John onto a second sled. He hated that. Some old part of him rose in protest. He was the one who carried, the one who pulled, the one who stayed upright until everyone else was safe. But his body was done arguing. As the rescue team began the descent, Max lay close beside him on the sled, head across John's ribs, careful of the pain, careful in the way only loyal animals knew how to be. Giovanni's litter moved ahead, orange rope bright against the snow. Elise walked between them and the tree line, watching for the bear, watching the weather, watching the living. No music rose over the mountain, no banners, no medals, no glorious speech beneath the white dawn. Only the scrape of rescue sleds over snow. Only the soft rasp of tired breathing. Only Max's warm muzzle against John's chest, checking again and again that the heart beneath it still answered. And somewhere behind them, beyond the trees, the bear returned to the wild kingdom that had never belonged to them. 3 weeks later, the snow still covered the Sawtooth foothills, but it no longer looked like a sentence. It lay over the small Idaho town in soft layers, bright along rooftops, gentle on fence rails, blue in the shadows beneath bare cottonwoods. Morning smoke rose from chimneys. Trucks moved slowly through salted streets. Somewhere near the feed store, a bell over a door kept ringing as people stepped in from the cold and stamped winter from their boots. John Rourke had learned that survival did not end when the rescue sled reached the road. Survival continued in smaller, less dramatic ways. It continued in the clinic room where he sat too stiffly, while a nurse checked his bruised shoulder and told him, with professional cheer, that he was lucky nothing had torn badly. It continued in the motel room where he woke at 3 a.m, hand reaching for a rope that was no longer across his chest. It continued in the silence after people said, "You're safe now," as though safety were a switch someone could flip in the bones. He was better. That was not the same as healed. His ribs ached when he breathed too deep. His right shoulder protested whenever he lifted anything above chest height. The rope burn across him had faded from raw red to a dull, ugly purple. At night, he still heard Giovanni's aluminum strip striking wood. Clang, clang, clang. A heartbeat in the snow. Max recovered with more dignity than John did, which was annoying because Max also limped around the motel room as though auditioning for a tragedy. The German shepherd's front paw had been cleaned, treated, and wrapped properly. The cut was healing, but Dr. Samuel Pike had ordered limited movement, which Max interpreted as a personal attack. Dr. Pike ran the town's only veterinary clinic from a low building that smelled faintly of cedar shavings, antiseptic, and dog biscuits. He was 58, broad through the middle, with a calm, round face, a short silver beard, and hands so gentle that even Max had only considered biting him once. The first time Pike examined Max, he crouched instead of standing over him. "Old working dog?" he asked. "Retired K9, John said. Pike nodded, as if that explained both the body and the soul. They retire from the job. They don't always retire from guarding the world. Max had watched the veterinarian with grave suspicion. Pike cleaned the paw, checked the old shoulder stiffness, then slipped Max a small treat with the smooth skill of a man accustomed to bribing warriors. "Don't tell him I gave you that," Pike said to John. "I was about to say the same thing." Pike's eyes crinkled. "Dogs can't read eulogies, so they lie beside us until we remember how to breathe evenly. That one's been doing overtime." John had no answer for that. He only rested one hand on Max's neck and felt the old steady warmth under the fur. Giovanni Bellarosa also survived, though he treated the word as if it were a minor administrative inconvenience. His shoulder needed therapy. His hip bruising had spread in alarming colors, which he described as a Renaissance sunset painted by a drunk. The cold had taken more from him than he admitted, but not his humor. Nurses learned quickly that if Giovanni became too polite, he was in pain. If he complained about hospital coffee, he was improving. John visited him twice during the first week. Shah? The third time, Giovanni was sitting near a window in a recovery room, wrapped in a cardigan someone had brought from home. His burgundy cap rested on the table beside him. The walnut box was there, too, empty now except for a few gray traces in the corners and the faint scent of mountain air that John was probably imagining. Giovanni looked smaller indoors. Outside on the mountain, stubbornness had made him seem almost mythic, a half-frozen old carpenter arguing with gods and bears. Here, under fluorescent lights, he was only a tired man with trembling hands and a heart that had outlived too many rooms. "You look terrible," Giovanni said. John paused in the doorway. "Good to see you, too." "I mean it kindly. Some men look handsome when injured." You look like a chair that lost a bar fight." Max, wearing his fresh bandage and carrying himself like a decorated veteran of unjust medical persecution, limped to Giovanni's chair and placed his head on the old man's knee. Giovanni's face softened at once. "Ah," he whispered, stroking the dog's ears. "Here is the beautiful one." John sat down across from him. For a while, they did not talk about the mountain. They talked about snowplows, weak coffee, Pike's treat smuggling operation, and the fact that Giovanni believed physical therapy was invented by cheerful sadists. Then the old man reached into a paper folder beside his chair and pulled out a photograph. Not the old picture of him and Marco on the ridge. This one showed a house. It was 2 stories, white once, though winter and time had softened it toward gray. A porch wrapped around one side. Behind it stood an apple orchard, bare-branched and patient beneath snow. The fence leaned in places. One gutter sagged. The chimney looked solid, though the roof near the back needed work. John studied it. "My house," Giovanni said, "at the edge of town." "It's a good house." "It was. It has become dramatic in my absence." John handed the photograph back, but Giovanni did not take it. "I cannot manage it alone any more," the old man said. There it was. Not weakness exactly. More difficult than weakness. Admission. John kept quiet. The porch boards need replacing. The orchard needs pruning. The back fence is leaning as if it heard bad news. The stove smokes when the wind comes from the east. I have tools. I have wood. I have opinions. Giovanni glanced at him. The opinions are unfortunately permanent. John began to understand and immediately looked away. No, he said. Giovanni's brows rose. I have not asked yet. You're going to. Very rude, this military mind reading. I'm not looking for charity. Good, I am not offering any. John's jaw tightened. Giovanni leaned forward as much as his hip allowed. His humor remained, but something firmer moved beneath it. I am offering work, he said. Temporary, if that makes your pride less theatrical. You and Max come stay at the house. You help repair what I can no longer repair. I teach you carpentry badly enough that Marco will complain from heaven. We eat soup. The dog supervises. No one owes anyone a life. John looked at the photograph again. A porch. A chimney. Bare apple trees waiting for spring. It should have looked simple. Instead, it frightened him. A mountain storm was easier. A bear was easier. A man could understand teeth, cold, rope burn, pain. But a house asked different questions. It asked whether he would unpack, whether he would sleep without boots near the bed, whether he would allow mornings to arrive without treating them as an ambush. It asked whether a new room was betrayal. My place is in Boise, John said. Is it? Giovanni asked. John did not answer. He thought of the house he had left behind. Evelyn's mug still in the cabinet. Claire's books in a box he had never opened. Max lying outside a closed door, waiting for footsteps that had become part of another world. That house held love, yes. But lately it had held him the way ice held a branch, perfectly, silently, until the branch forgot it had ever been alive. Giovanni seemed to read enough. No one replaces the dead, John, he said quietly. That is not how love works. The table does not forget those who sat there before. The living only learn to set another chair without removing the old ones. John looked down. Max's tail thumped once against Giovanni's wheelchair. Traitor, John thought. Max looked pleased with his vote. A few days later, Ranger Elise Hartman stopped by Pike's clinic while John was waiting for Max's bandage change. She came in carrying cold air and the smell of pine resin, her forest green jacket dusted with snow, orange rescue rope still clipped at her hip. She looked less severe indoors, though only by a small margin. Figured I'd find you two here, she said. Max is being medically oppressed, John said. Max gave a soft huff that supported the claim. Elise handed John a folded report. Thought you'd want to know. Wildlife team tracked the bear. Old male, underweight, likely pushed out of higher territory and food conditioned from campers last season. They hazed him away from the main trail corridor. No lethal action. John read the page slowly. The bear had not been killed. For a long moment he stood with the paper in his hand and felt again the red flare, the roar, Max's teeth on his packstrap, Giovanni's tapping in the storm. Good, John said at last. Elise studied him. That surprise you? No? He folded the paper carefully. It just matters. She nodded. John looked through the clinic window toward the mountains, pale and distant beyond town. Not everything that scares us deserves to be destroyed. Elise's expression shifted, not quite a smile, but close. Mountains teach that, if people survive the first lesson. Pike emerged from the exam room then, wiping his hands on a towel. Max Rourke? Max rose with visible resignation. John followed him in, but Giovanni's words had already begun working through him, like warmth under a door. The house waited another week before John said yes. Not dramatically, no grand speech, no sudden transformation. He simply stood in the motel room one morning while Max stared at him from the foot of the bed, the dog's ears tilted in that ancient judgmental way, and said, "Fine, we'll look at it." Max jumped up too quickly, winced at his paw, then pretended nothing had happened. "Exactly," John said. "You're the reason we can't have dignity." The apple orchard house sat at the edge of town, where the road bent toward open fields, and the foothills rose blue beyond them. Snow covered the roof in soft folds. The porch did creak. The fence did lean. The stove did indeed cough smoke when Giovanni demonstrated it, then blamed the chimney, the wind, and possibly the moral decline of modern firewood. But the house was warm, not perfectly warm, not storybook warm, real warm. I'd the kind made of drafts under doors, soup on the stove, old wood holding summer in its grain, and a dog immediately deciding which rug belonged to him. Max chose the one nearest the hearth. Giovanni objected. "That rug is antique." John looked at the frayed edges. "From which war?" "The war against taste. We are losing." Max lowered his head and closed his eyes. The matter was settled. John carried his duffel upstairs to a spare room facing the orchard. He did not unpack everything, not at first, but he placed Evelyn's wind chime on the windowsill and Claire's red glove beside it. Then he stood there, looking at them in the light. No thunder rolled, no pain vanished, no voice came from heaven telling him he had done well. But he did not feel the urge to hide them again. That evening, Giovanni sat near the hearth with the empty walnut box on his lap. He ran his thumb over Marco's initials once, then set the box on the mantel. Not as a shrine, not as a wound, as part of the house. John watched him. "Does it help?" he asked. Giovanni considered. "No." John almost smiled. "Then yes," Giovanni added. "A little." After supper, John stepped onto the back porch. Snow fell gently over the orchard. Bare apple branches reached upward, black against the dimming sky, like hands waiting for something green to return. He took Evelyn's wind chime from inside and hung it from a porch beam. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the winter breeze moved through the silver tubes. The sound was small, clear, not frantic now, not lost in a storm. Just a few bright notes spilling into the orchard, thin as starlight, steady as breath. John felt Max beside him before he looked down. The dog leaned against his leg, shoulder warm, bandaged paw resting lightly on the porch boards. Behind them, Giovanni called from inside, "If that thing keeps me awake, I will charge it rent." John looked at Max. Max looked back, and John laughed. Not much, not loudly, but enough that the sound surprised him, enough that Giovanni went quiet inside the house as if he understood better than to interrupt a rare bird landing. John touched the red glove in his pocket. "I'm still here," he whispered, not to the mountain this time, and not only to the dead. The wind chime rang again. Inside, the fire shifted. Giovanni began humming something that might have been opera and might have been a threat. Max groaned and pressed his head against John's knee, as if begging him to stop the old man before the neighbors armed themselves with tomatoes. John stood on the porch of a house he had not meant to need, beneath a winter sky that no longer felt entirely empty. Nothing was healed completely. But the room inside his heart, the one he had kept locked for a year, had a window open now. And through it came snowlight, wood smoke, the ridiculous humming of an old carpenter, and the breathing of a dog who had never abandoned his post. Sometimes healing does not arrive like thunder from heaven. Sometimes it comes as a wounded dog refusing to leave, an old man keeping one last promise, and a broken soldier choosing to keep walking when grief tells him to stop. John did not find a way to erase his loss. He found something quieter, a reason to stay, a table with another chair, and a reminder that God's grace often reaches us through the ones who need us just as much as we need them. If this story touched your heart, share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us who has been your Max in a season of loss, the one who helped you keep breathing. And if you want more stories of loyalty, courage, and hope, please subscribe and walk with us again. May peace find you gently, even in the coldest seasons of life.